Emotional algebra, where the heart meets the math. What is integral is derivative as you figure out your path. Power plus emotions equals more than you can see. Listening to the wisdom of
Welcome to Emotional Algebra with Dr. E. Emotional Algebra is a podcast that helps listeners to understand the subtle calculations people make every day in their relationships with others. It's a podcast to help us all become better people through understanding the different variables that drive our behaviors. I'm your co-host, Andrew Tavani.
And I'm Dr. E.
Dr. E, good to see you again. We've got a really interesting guest today. His name is Michael Lopez. Dr. E, you want to talk a little bit about him before we bring him on?
Well, he's been a leadership coach and consultant. He has an interesting background and also has his own podcast that he interviews some of the top voices on LinkedIn. So he's got a lot of interesting content. He's got a book that we'll talk with him about as well. And let's go ahead and bring him on in.
So, Michael, great to have you here. Tell us a little bit about some of the strategies you're bringing to people and what you're doing. It sounds like a little bit of self-help, but maybe even more involved than that.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me again, guys. And, I really do appreciate, I get this question a lot of how did you get, this job? And this job is really, I help individuals, teams, and organizations change and transform. And that may sound pretty general, but the truth is, all of us, companies, teams, leaders, people, individuals, we're all setting goals continuously in our lives and trying to find better ways to get there, kind of bigger, stronger, faster. And so, I've spent years as an athlete. I played college football. I spent time working with the military and getting some amazing experiences there. And then many decades working with companies. And, the truth of the matter is the unit of measurement in the world of change is the individual. And change is a very personal, unpredictable, nonlinear, asymmetric experience. And I saw too many times we were doing things with companies that they felt good that we were taking some action to try to help groups of people change, but you got to get down to the individual level and really understand what they're struggling with, what their goals are, what their practices are, and then work with those things to kind of help them get better. So that's what I do. I'm having a great time doing it. And the book that I wrote that you mentioned is really the beginning of a new conversation around change that I hope people will enjoy and check out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you, like what? Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Dr. E. Yeah.
Yeah. So how did you come up with the science-based changes that you're looking at in your book? Did you do a lot of research? Is it based on some clinical results that you've found and also tying it into your experience?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, there's more research, as you know, Dr. E, about the human brain that at any point, and now with all our ability to access information, what I really did was just compiled what was out there. This started for me, really this journey of diving into the neuroscience in about 2020, when we all hit the pandemic and we all collectively experienced the most dramatic environmental shift that we'll ever experience in our lives. And it changed a lot of things for everyone. That was right around the time that Andrew Huberman launched the Huberman Lab podcast, which is a great one. It was sort of like going to medical school. And so I started listening to that, getting curious about what he was talking about, reading the studies. And so over the last 3-4 years, I've really just compiled what was there. And then I matched that with the strategies that I was using as a consultant and as a coach that I didn't really have a language for. I just knew some of these things worked, as an athlete or, working with teams on the field or, working in boardrooms with CEOs. And so it really became an organic kind of, two roads coming together to form a bit of a superhighway. And so I've referenced all of that in the book and cited those sources that have really done some groundbreaking work in the field of neuroscience.
Very good. So we had a guest on, a good friend of mine, Greg Wittstock. He's called the pond guy. He kind of redesigned the way that ponds and water features are built. But he told a story about how one of his greatest experiences in life that prepared him to be CEO, president of his company was football, high school football, and the coach that he had. And you mentioned that you played football as well. So how would you say that football for you and sports for you help prepare you for life and what you're doing and even your coaching experiences?
Yeah, every great thing I've learned about being a leader and a teammate came from playing football, team sports. I played high school football, I played college football. I now coach high school. You see a picture right there behind me. That
Hmm.
actually happens to be my son, is number 11, and my best friend superimposed a picture of me from college next to him. He's
Oh,
about to be a
wow.
senior in high school, and he's 1,000 times better than I ever was. And fortunately, he's pretty tall, so that really helps. But
Mhm.
I think that the first part of being a leader is learning how to be a follower and understanding the work it takes to be part of a team where it's not about you, it's about us. And I
Mhm.
think the world of sports, particularly team sports, is where that foundation gets laid, and where it was laid for me. I think the second thing for me, it's always been about trust in your teammates and learning how to rely and be interdependent on
Mhm.
others in order to perform. And in the corporate world today, nobody does anything alone. Even if you're working with AI, you still have a partner in that
Right.
experience of understanding how to ask questions, how to get results, how to how to move information. And a lot of what I do in the world of corporate consulting is rebuilding trust among teams that have lost it for some reason. And then I think it's the last part for me is really understanding the experience and the science of adaptation, right? Being an athlete, performing on the field, you practice a lot more than you play. And I think there's real wisdom in that experience for our behavior and for how organizations perform.
Mhm.
And so understanding the power of small improvements, understanding the importance of small tweaks, the experience of
Mhm.
failure and setbacks in the growth experience. And so,
Mhm.
those things for me have been sort of immutable principles that have served me my entire life. And, I coach because I still love the game and I love being a part of the game. I love the strategy. But really for me, it's about giving back to the young men that I was so fortunate to have so many great coaches that, that's where teaching happens. And I think a coaching culture, a culture of coaching, being hands-on with teams is just so
Mhm.
important. And that's how I work as a consultant. I tell my clients that when you buy me, you get me. I'm in the board, I'm in the meetings, I'm in the hard moments, I'm designing the workshops, because that connective tissue and experience of coach to player, or coach to client, consultant to client, whatever words you want to use, is really where the magic happens. And so I've just been blessed, and I'll keep giving back until the day I run out of time.
Mhm. Excellent. Actually, I used to play soccer and coached soccer, and I loved it. I you coach kids from 4 to 7, and then 8 to 10, and then 11 to 14, and all those different ages. I really love the little kids the most because I didn't focus on winning. At that age, I think there's certain ages that you don't want to focus on the win. You want to focus on skill acquisition. We have enough time in life to learn about winning and losing, and how to do that with grace and stuff. But I think we focus too much too early on that idea of win and lose. That's why I teach what I teach about power, about equity versus hierarchy.
Yeah.
So when the kids would come up after the game and said, "Did we win?" I said, "Did you have fun?" They said, "Yeah." I said, "Then we all won." And in that, teaching that idea of that it is a we mentality in the team. And if you don't have trust, especially on a team, you don't really have a community, you don't have a team, you can't have a family, you just have a bunch of people who are interacting often from places of fear and doubt, and all those disruptions of those emotions that are fear-based and pain-based, rather than ones that are more collaborative and what I say are love-based. And it sounds like that's exactly what you're talking about as well.
Yeah, I try my best to impart a host of life lessons. You've given some really great ones, and one that I'd add to your mix, and maybe this is for older athletes, but so much of what we do around sports and competition or setting goals is we're sort of running scared, right? We're worried about making mistakes, and I think two things are important. Mistakes are essential, right? They are necessary in the growth experience. And so removing the fear of mistakes is a really important thing, right? I mean, my son also plays baseball, right? If you're standing at the plate, you're thinking, I'm going to strike out. I don't want to strike out. I don't want to strike out, right? Your chances of striking out go up pretty significantly. So one of the things I talk to my athletes about is this idea of striving for greatness, not perfection, right? This idea that I'm reaching for growth, and that may mean I miss, right? But it's the experience of not being afraid to reach for me that's so important. And so, nothing great ever happened because we played it safe. And I think so much of that is helping young athletes build a mentality that will serve them so much more in the rest of their lives. So for me, that's a big piece of it too.
Right. And they're extending that further. There's I minored in sports psychology in graduate school. And in that we had this saying that perfect practice makes perfect. So there's a lot of times we're doing these reps, and if you do the reps incorrectly, you're training that muscle memory, that psychological memory. So that whole idea, part of that perfect practice makes perfect is mindset. So you're exactly right in saying, I don't want to strike out. I don't want to strike out. Well, there's a theory in hypnosis that says that the subconscious doesn't recognize the word not. So when somebody says, I don't want to strike out, it's basically saying, I do want to strike out. So when we look at how we extend that to different areas in our life, I don't want to say the wrong thing in my job interview, or I don't want to say the wrong thing to my spouse or my kids. When we get in that place of avoidance of the negative, we often invite the idea of that perceived negative in, and then it often leads to that risk of that happening even more.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've hit on three of the strategies that are in my book, right? So one of them is about generating repetition. So this idea that any behavior change that you undertake, it's going to require a lot of repetition, more than you expect and more that you want, right? It's going to take you a long time to retrain those pathways to execute a new behavior. And, back to the world of sports and learning about our bodies and a skill development, the same is true for skills. And yet we go into the world of behavior and we think, oh, maybe if I just take a 30-minute workshop or online class, I'll somehow magically be different, right? No, it's going to take you a lot of repetitions to go through that experience. And then, one of the other things about this idea is creating mistakes, right? We talk about focusing on mistakes as an opportunity for growth and understanding this idea that feedback from mistakes, right? So I don't want to strike out. I don't want to say the wrong thing. But when you do say the wrong thing or you do strike out, it's a signal to the brain that something needs to change. Now, if I pay attention to that and I'm willing to face that moment and really analyze it, well, that's where the growth happens, right? And so this idea of focusing on those opportunities for growth is a big thing I talk about. And, in the world of corporate leadership, right, we don't like to look wrong. We don't like to make mistakes. We don't like to project the idea that I don't know the answer. And so we end up in some pretty difficult places because we're sort of unwilling to face that. So those are just some of the things that I try to take from the world of sports and from the world of neuroscience and put a lens on it for the corporate world to give people a greater toolkit to help them change.
Absolutely.
Now, I never played football. It's one of the big regrets of my life, but just being a fan of it and watching a lot of it, it seems to me that football, maybe when we talked about trust, Dr. E I think you both actually brought up building trust among coworkers, colleagues, so forth. It seems like football is maybe the sport that relies on trust the most. Just given the way plays are designed, you've got 11 guys on one side of the ball, all trying to accomplish a common goal, and they've all got their own individual assignments within each play. And so I'm wondering if you agree with that, and B, if what you find is useful that can be applied to just people working in more mundane situations than being on a football field.
Yeah. Well, I'm biased. So clearly I think that that's true. Although look, in any sport, there are versions of trust that show up in different ways. And so I think, maybe to debate the subtler points, we could have a debate about that, which sport has the most trust in it. There's certainly more immediate impacts of a lack of trust, right? And I would tell my son, playing quarterback, I played quarterback too, right? If somebody in front of you makes a mistake, you're going to get that feedback pretty quickly because you're going to end up on the ground, right? So I think one of the nice parts about that is maybe the time horizon is shrunk in a way that allows you to get that feedback, which which I think does apply to the world of broader teams and maybe knowledge work. Or I've had clients that run nuclear power stations and talk about trust that's required from a safety perspective, right? It doesn't get much more serious than that. Some of the things that I think end up eroding trust in organizations and therefore need to be rebuilt. One of them I talked about, right? This idea of the time horizon between the loss of trust and the impact. In the corporate world, unless somebody's shooting at you or you're on an operating table, right? Those are places where it's pretty immediate feedback that I rely on you to perform an action. And if you don't do that, something disastrous happens. In most teams, we don't have that time horizon. And so the challenge becomes, how do I equate an action today with an outcome tomorrow? And if I perceive one of my teammates not pulling their weight, well, then I've got a lot of time to fill that space with negative assumptions, negative judgments, whatever it may be, right? So there's this idea of time dimension. I actually talk a little bit in the book about some of what our perspective and perception of time does to our ability to change. It's pretty interesting, and things that I learned along the way. I think that's the first piece. One of the second pieces that plays a big role in trust among teams and organizations are incentives, right? And so, there's a whole stacked set of incentives around companies and outcomes, from profit to revenue goals to individual pay to bonuses to more intrinsic things like purpose and service and that sort of thing. And so if you don't have clarity around the hierarchy of incentives that matter to us collectively and really get people to buy into that, then what you can get is a lot of people that are using self-derived motivation to go chase things that are important to them, as opposed to things that maybe are more important collectively. And so that's a really tough thing to do in an organization, because again, there's just layers to it, right? There's so many dimensions of a company. It's why we talk about why purpose is so important. And so, in a sports team, there's one goal, right? It's to win. And so that allows people to really focus in. I think the third thing that I would talk about, and it's kind of tied to incentives, are, what we get when we achieve the goal, right? And so in the world of sports, that moment, the championship, the ring, the trophy, that those shared experiences become pretty obvious. It's harder in the corporate world at times, not impossible, but it's why you see things like startup companies where everybody's in that moment, right? They're sort of grinding every day, 20 hours a day, 18 hours a day to go build something that goes public and everybody becomes a millionaire. Those kinds of shared experiences where there's high intensity, high stakes, those are really trust building kind of experiences. You get them in the military, right? People that fought alongside and served alongside their teammates, right? What do those people say when they've retired, right? I remember the moments of camaraderie, the moments that we were a team, the hard moments together. You get that in sports, you get that in those worlds. So part of my job is how do I simulate that kind of experience for people so they feel a real reliance on each other, so that we have a shared reality. So it's tough. It's not impossible. And when you get it right, really, really amazing things happen.
Mm-hmm. So in that whole idea of trust, I always say the most precious gift that anybody can be given is trust. And what often happens, though, is when you're in your present circumstance, people want to think that they're responding really only from the present. But often they're responding from their past, bringing their past beliefs, experience, expectations, emotions, attitudes, and beliefs into that experience. And that's what the hard thing is in running a corporate or company culture, whether it's small or even at a corporate level, is everybody's bringing in their own stuff. If they have common belief systems, that's great. But I think that sometimes you want differing belief systems can build even a stronger culture in the long run. It's just you have to work through really that communication and connection to understand where each other's coming from. But often what I see is so often in life that people's issues that they want to keep suppressed or buried in the back, and they live their ideal self rather than their feel, and they therefore don't recognize their real self that's being shown to the world. And I think that's what you're talking about as well in what you do.
Yeah. And, certainly, I'm not clinically trained the way you are. So I would defer to you in terms of your uncovering and peeling back the onion of those layers. What I do know, and this is in the book, is some groundbreaking work by Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett around the idea that our brains are prediction machines, right? Our brains are constantly guessing what may happen to us next. And the most base version of why that happens is our brain's job is to keep us alive, right? It's managing the resources of our body to make sure our heart keeps beating. And that's a very intricate, complicated process of, as you know. The challenge with that, to your point, is that it's not just about the guessing that we're doing at the immediate sort of survival level, but no two brains on planet Earth are the same. They'll never be the same. It's impossible. And so everything that's ever happened to me is forming a database of experience from which I can only predict outcomes based on that experience. I can't predict something that I've never experienced. And so when you get 10 people in a room, if we don't have any shared experience to lean on together, well, then by definition, we're going to end up with 10 different predictions. And, a big part of my job, I call this aligning the brains in the room. My job is to help people have as much of a common denominator of shared experience as we can, so that they can start to see the world through the same lens. We're really just reprogramming those predictions so that when we set a goal, we all believe that that goal is, possible from the same angle. And that's why, again, back to the sports analogy, the shared experience are the countless hours of practice, right? You go back to my time in the military, it's all the drills, it's all of those things, so that when we get into the moment, right, however big that moment may be, we've got a bank of shared experiences that we can predict from. And so my job is to simulate that in the corporate world. And it's part of why I went out on my own is I found that the world of kind of change management, which is a phrase I don't even like, and in the kind of big consulting space was really missing the mark, right? It wasn't bringing the kind of skills and frameworks and methods that I thought were really effective or that really worked, sort of from a physical perspective, right? We know how to change the body, and yet we don't apply the same strategies to the brain. So that's what I do. That's what's, fun about it. But you're right. It's all about starting and understanding where people are coming from.
So, what are some of the bigger emotional issues that you see on a whole these days as you're working with management teams and leadership? How do you see those emotions being expressed, or what are the things you want to help people to really recognize and change in their corporate culture and company cultures emotionally?
Yeah. Fear's a big one, and it shows up in different ways. Fear of loss. I just did a LinkedIn post about this the other day, about the fear of loss. Our brain values loss more than it values gain, right? The loss aversion principle, which is if I gain $100, I'm less happy than if I were to lose $100, right? I'm more sad in sort of relative terms. And so, a lot of what companies and people will be doing is sort of running from fear, trying to stop loss in some way. And so there's a lot there that requires us to kind of, peel that back and understand why that is the case. And certainly the other side of it, I think on the gain side, is we're all chasing a different set of goals. And so emotionally, I think there's this principle of people will say, I'll be happy when, right? I'll be happy when I get the job. I'll be happy when I get the house. I'll be happy when I get the thing that I desire. And so there's a lot about helping people ground themselves in the present. There's a lot of future-based thinking, which is that, someday I'll be the best version of myself if only these things will happen. And so I spend a lot of time helping ground people in the present and understanding what their current experience is. And that's uncomfortable, right? Because it forces them to face maybe moments that they've been avoiding, right? By staring into the distance. I think the other thing that I see a lot of is sort of this, sort of confidence overload, or maybe a little bit of imposter syndrome tied in there, right? Look, we are all learning, and you should be learning your whole life. And if anyone, this idea that you can't teach an old dog new tricks, it's not true. You can learn your entire life. I hope you learned something new the day before they close the casket, right? And yet we all project a lot of confidence and certainty because we feel like that needs to be the foundation of leadership. And, leadership is about including others in the process of growth. And so, I think helping people be vulnerable is really, really where I spend a lot of time. It's okay to not know. It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to make mistakes. It's necessary. And so, those things are things I face in the corporate world quite a bit. And it's, look, those are just normal human emotions that, that we go through in all layers of our lives.
Well, you're talking about, and you're really bringing through that idea of hierarchy versus equity, which is, those are the two models of power that I teach. And I think the irony is, so many, even we look at leadership, whether it's political or corporate or family, people tend to fall back into that fear-based hierarchical management style that, yeah, if I'm the big circle, then I'm in charge and I have to be perfect and good and strong and right so I can be seen as a winner. And when we do that, we don't really understand the value of each emotion. When we look at equity, that's where we see a lot of corporate cultures having moved to, with a lot of the understanding of what helps a company really thrive more is more equity based and empowerment based programs. When we look at that hierarchical structure, which we seem to be returning to politically in our country, you see things like groupthink, that people aren't able to share their true perspectives out of fear of the consequences of doing that. And that's why, even you go back to JFK removed himself from some of those cabinet meetings, because he knew that the other cabinet members wanted to please him. And he knew, after the thing was the Bay of Pigs, I think when that happened, or Cuban Missile, one of those situations where he's like, I have to step out and trust my people enough to make these decisions. So even as we look at the value of our emotions from an equity standpoint, fear lets me know when I might need to protect myself. Failure tells me when it's time to learn. Guilt lets me know when I've done something to somebody else I need to fix. Shame lets me know when I've done something to myself I need to fix. Confusion lets me know when I need more information. So as you're teaching people the value of emotions, and that failure is absolutely okay, and to extend that, I always teach that stupid is failure times X. There's nothing wrong with those emotions. So that's why I got to the idea of emotional algebra, because that intersection of all these different emotions and the equations behind our decisions that lead to outcomes. And that what we find is, often many of us who are really, to me, I see so many people I've talked to on the show, that when we look at what made them successful, what helped them find success, what helped them with their resilience, it wasn't a hierarchical approach of power over. It was a more equity-based approach of power with, and helping us to find others, to find their empowerment, and most importantly, to find our own. The collaboration of what you're doing with your teams is, and even what science is in many ways telling us, it's understanding that put into action.
Yeah, you said a lot of great stuff there, and one of the things that's a common phrase that I use, it's in my book, is this idea that there's a formula for change, but change is not formulaic, right? And this idea that in the world of emotional algebra, your unique formula is going to be a function of your experience and your goals and your needs, and that's exactly what is happening in the world of change, right? There's these 6 strategies, but I know they all work, but the how much to dial up of one for you versus somebody else is going to be a little bit different, right? And that's, again, because no two brains are the same. And so I just love this idea that we know a lot about the process of change, but your process of change is going to be about where you're starting, where you're going, what you've experienced, and all of that. And that's why I say the unit of measurement is the person, right? What works for you may not exactly work for me, at least in the same order of magnitude. And so that's just so important. And the other thing that I think is really great about what you said, and it's one of my favorite leadership principles, actually comes from the Navy SEALs, which is, they say that whoever knows what to do next is the leader. And that could change moment to moment, right? It's this idea that there is an equity and a trust among this team, that whoever knows where to go next and what to do, we follow that person until the next moment requires another brain to decide where we go. And so, look, hierarchy serves a purpose, and there's things around information flow and risk and crises that allow us to have, a top to bottom experience and understanding of where we sit in an organization, and that provides some value. There's nothing wrong with those things, but to your point, in small moments, right, what we find is that an equitable approach of distributing information and making decisions is far more effective. And so, that's where I spend my time as well. And I just love that concept that you teach.
No, I appreciate that. And again, likewise, I'm really, it's been great to hear your approach. And as you say that I'm the expert, but you are an expert. And I think that's one thing I want to see. There are a lot of people who might have a PhD or an MD or things like that, but it doesn't mean that they know. I always say, wisdom is the application of the qualitative interpretation of experience over time. And there are a lot of people who have degrees or age or experience that really haven't applied that. And that's one thing that you've clearly done, is you've grown in a great deal of wisdom through your ability to accept that every day is a learning experience and an opportunity.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm really proud of as I've made this turn in my career, and I think I mentioned it earlier, is I'm a practitioner. I want to do this work. I don't just want to talk about it. I don't just want to sell it to companies and then, have a bunch of 20-something MBAs come do the work. Not that there's anything wrong with those people. I used to be one, but it's important for me, like you, to be in practice, to be in moments, to work with individuals, and to kind of get my hands dirty in the world of change. Sometimes I don't get it right either, right? And so for me, being where I am in this phase of my career just allows me to sit with leaders, sit with teams, sit with individuals, and do the hard work of change, and help them meet their goals. So yeah, I really am having a great time, and it's just great to be kind of in the fire with others as they go through that experience.
Now, Michael, you have a interesting background, as we mentioned, and you sort of alluded to it a little bit. Your work with the military or in the intelligence community. I want to understand about what you learned or what you sort of took away from that experience that sort of applies to what you do now, and sort of what the difference is. You were talking a lot about emotions today. Dr. E is talking about kind of what they mean, and you talk about, running into a lot of fear. How important were emotions in that sort of work? Or were they meant to be sort of, suppressed, or were they seen as valuable, kind of the way Dr. E views them?
Yeah. So I worked for about 5 years in the Defense Intelligence Agency as an intelligence officer, and I tell a story about this in the book, so I won't ruin it all, but at the ripe age of 25, 26, I was the senior air defense analyst to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, just because I raised my hand. There was another senior civilian who didn't want to do it. And so I raised my hand and really got a front row seat, as close as you could get without pulling the trigger, to what it's like to execute a military campaign. And this is in the 1998 range. We're in the war in Kosovo, and working in the Pentagon. I think I worked for 92 days straight from 4 a.m. until 8 p.m. at night, supporting the men and women that are executing a campaign like that. It really helps you understand that the stakes are never higher than in those moments. And so for me, the rest of my career, I just remember thinking that these are actually people shooting at each other, and this is real war. And most people, thankfully, don't ever have that experience, but the ones that do, it is an incredibly formative moment. And so I just remember, a story in particular. The first day we were executing the air campaign, and you come back and you see the pictures of targets that you've picked, and you understand that this isn't a game, right? This isn't make believe. This is real life. And so I think, all of the emotions that come with that, which are not as much fear as you would expect, sort of the magnitude of the moment, right? You feel small and yet powerful in strange ways. This idea that you're part of this chain of events that leads to impacts in real human life is just a sobering reality that people who've been in that experience, and far more, frontline than I ever have, will tell you. So for me, it just put things into perspective. And I guess I'm fortunate from a pretty early age in my professional career. I've been in meetings with executives and they're having arguments, and I'm like, this is not. It's going to be okay, right? We're all going to be okay. This isn't that serious, and so I think it helps with that perspective. At the same time, I mean, when the stakes are that high, you feel the sort of the moment, the anxiety bordering on exhilaration of understanding what's happening around you, right? And understanding that the words you choose and the analysis that you do. There was a moment after the first day where they called me upstairs, and I sat in this room, and it was the chief of staff of the Air Force, the J2, the J3, three House of Representatives, the sitting senator, the head of the Armed Services Committee, more stars on shoulders than you could imagine. And here I am, 20 something years old, and they're asking me, tell us what happened today. Tell us what you think, right? Tell us what you know. And I remember being terrified. First of all, you just kind of sit there and you're like, okay, there's 1,000 years of collective experience in that room. And here I am, I'm sort of barely out of school. But I remember being incredibly grateful to the men and women in that room who gave a young person like me a chance to share what I knew and to treat me as the expert. And for me, I just remember thinking to myself, I'm always going to pay this back to people when I get into this space, right? Just because you're young, just because you're new, it doesn't mean you don't know anything, right? Tell us what you know. They didn't ask me, tell me everything. They said, tell us what you know. Tell us what you think. And we'll fill in the spaces. So for me, that was an incredible leadership lesson. And then, the last one, like you mentioned, and we've talked about, is the power of teams. I mean, there's an incredible layer of process and connection and dependency and trust that goes on in the experience of executing a campaign like that. And so for me, it just became another example coming out of my playing career to say, these are incredible teams too. Here's another version of an incredible team that requires a high degree of trust and coordination. And so, yeah, what a mission-driven place. These are people that literally give their lives in the service of their country, and it's an incredible thing to watch.
Yeah, and talking about building trust, it was a lot of trust that they placed in you. It sounds to me like you appreciate that at this stage of life, looking back.
Yeah, I mean, they had no reason to, honestly. I mean, I didn't, I was very junior. I raised my hand, and, one of the best pieces of advice I ever got, and fortunately in this case, I got to live it myself early, was always raise your hand for the hardest job that nobody else wants to do. And even if you fail, people will trust you for having the courage to step forward. And, I just learned so much and met so many great people. I was 25 years old running a team of 10 people that worked around the clock. Many of them were in their 50s and 60s. And so, you had to meet the moment. And looking back, I guess I'm glad I didn't think too hard about it when I just raised my hand. But yeah, always trust people, give them a chance to learn and grow. I had great leaders and mentors around me when I did make mistakes, and I made plenty. Let's be clear about that. I made plenty of mistakes that were there to support me as well. So I certainly wasn't operating in a vacuum.
I love what you just said. Always raise your hand for the job that nobody else wants to do. And again, that the willingness to do that will depend on the culture, though, that often is behind that. If it is a culture of fear, people are like, I don't want to fail. I don't want to be the one blamed with this outcome. So that experience you had is so valuable, and you're right, it is formative. So again, great quote. I might use that.
That is a great
quote. As much as you want. And there's actually a part in the book about and I didn't know this at the time, but so there's a part of our brain called the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, and it's actually increases in size and sort of territory when we do hard things. And so there's a bunch of great science in the book to talk about, but there is real truth to this idea that when we do hard things, we live longer, we perform better, and it's all relative and subjective. And I was lucky enough at the time to do something really hard that, again, going later in life, future hard things seem less hard. And so it's a big piece of this strategy, and there's real truth, right? Do hard things, and whatever that means to you, if you're scared of it, that's a good signal to go right through the middle of it, and you're going to be okay, right? You're going to be okay, and you're going to be a better person on the other side. And so I was just lucky enough to have something pretty dramatic in that stage of life. And so,
Yeah.
obviously I'm not there anymore. I've moved on to other things, but I'm just very grateful for that opportunity.
What do you think, looking back, sort of made you raise your hand in that moment? You said there was a much more senior person who just didn't want to take on that assignment and was afraid to, perhaps. What do
Yeah.
you think about you? Had you gone through some hard things already that you felt like, yeah, I got this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all, I had a pretty good, kind of upbringing. I will say one of the things that happened to me. So I'm not the biggest guy. I'm like 5'7". I was 160 pounds in high school, and I played quarterback. And my high school coach told me I'd never play football in college, and I just remember thinking to myself, why would you say that to somebody? And no, you're wrong. And I did. And I think that was one of those moments where it's not about proving somebody else wrong. I mean, that was a little bit of the motivation, don't get me wrong, but it's about proving yourself right. And those 4 years that I spent in college, my teammates are my brothers, my coach is still like a father to me. Those experiences have transcended a lifetime of brotherhood and support for me that I am internally grateful for. And, had I listened to somebody who decided my fate for me before I had a chance to determine that on my own, I never would have had that experience. And so, I think just drawing from that and being like, I can do this too, and if I can't, I'll have people around me that will help me. And maybe that was naive in some ways. Fortunately, I was right. I think that's the thing to lean on is raise your hand, step into the hard moment, and then surround yourself with people that will build you up and pick you up when you fall down. And I'm blessed to have those two experiences be pretty close to each other. And it's carried me a long way in my life.
Well, if you look at it, that idea of faith, I talk a lot about faith. Faith to me is the gap between fear and absolute truth. And to me, I wouldn't say that you are naive. I would say that you had faith. You had faith in yourself. You had faith in people around you because you had a sense of trust. I had somebody tell me, a professor tell me I'd never make it into grad school. I did the same thing. I was like, yeah, I'll show you. Right. I did the senior honors thesis after that. I didn't have great grades because I did all kinds of other things. I had a jazz scholarship to music school. I had been an all-star soccer goalie. I had been a house manager in my fraternity for multiple years. So I had all these different interests that, as well as the creativity to do this senior thesis, that all he looked at was my grades, and he made this determination. And I ended up being the first one done to my master's, the first one done to my dissertation, the first one done to my comprehensive exams, all those things. Because while fear at times was a motivation, it was also my defiance and that I'll show you attitude that I've grown from. Because one of my therapists, best thing I ever heard was, you got where you are in spite of what you believed, not because of what you believed. Because I was a perfectionist and I did have the stress headaches and shoulder aches and all that stuff that that I was able to work through over the years, because I carried all the burdens of having to feel like I had to be perfect. There's a saying that says, better to have a few early losses and suffer the stresses of having to have a perfect season. So I think there's a lot to that. And one of the other things I wanted to follow up on what you were talking about is resilience. And resilience of kids today and younger generations, where they often don't want to take the hard jobs. They don't want to do the repetition it takes to learn something. And I think our education in some ways, unfortunately, is rewarding that in the way that they're teaching that, as long as you just do this, then that's good. And repetition is key, because it is about neural pathways. And you had mentioned that as well before. And it's like, I always say, like, a neural pathway, whether it's helpful or not helpful, is like walking across a field of wheat. And the first time you walk across that field of wheat, you look back and you can't really see where you walked. Then you walk back across it. You might see some of those wheat, things falling over. Then you walk across it back and forth enough times, you see a clear path to the dirt. So reprogramming those neural pathways is really difficult. And also then taking the risk to do that, because it can feel overwhelming, and it can feel scary, and it can feel unsure. And those are all, like you said, they're all great emotions to have, because
Yeah.
there is uncertainty in life, and that's where faith comes into play.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I would agree with you. I have a personal belief that resilience is the single most important characteristic we can have as people. I just believe deeply that your ability to get back from failure, to stand up, to face it, to walk through it, to recover, pick your phrase, it is the essential element of growing in life. And so for me, every great thing that has happened to me is because I've been willing to face a problem. I give
Mhm.
myself what's called a 12-hour rule, which is I have 12 hours to kind of kick rocks and feel bad for myself, and then it's time to move on. And I just sort of came up with that because it felt like the way for me. But movement is motivation for me, and it's something I talk about in the book. It's one of the principles. When you're unsure, move. When you're sure, move. When you don't know what to do, move. Right back to the Navy SEALs. What they say is when they're lost, the worst thing you could do is stay in place. Right? It's this idea that I don't get any new information by staying put. And so to get up, to move forward, to talk about it, to think about it, to watch the tape, to use the sports analogy, right? Why did I lose that game? What could I have done differently? I mean, that's what this whole thing is about. And I say to people, you use the word fear, and on the other side of your fear is a version of yourself that you haven't yet met, but can't wait to get to know, right? And if you can just go through the process of experiencing the uncertainty, the anxiety, the disappointment, whatever it is, there's a better version of you over there. You just have to walk through that field of wheat, right, for the first time. This is just a great journey. I'm 51. I'll be 52 in a couple weeks, and feel like I'm just getting started. So it's been a great ride.
I think anybody who you work with is lucky to have you. Just
I
hearing
appreciate
the
it.
way you approach things, again, how you've learned a lot, that just not only in life experiences, but really trying to seek the understanding and looking at the neurochemistry and the neuroscience beyond that, and able to tie all those things together. So, and your just general approach, like I said, really understanding those differences between hierarchy and equity, and what really works. You're impressive. I'm very impressed with our
I
discussion
appreciate
today.
that. Well, I'm in great company here in this call, and I appreciate you guys having me and giving me a chance. I always say this: I'm a big Marvel movie fan, and there's a great quote from Captain America when he says, "I can do this all day," and
Yeah.
I really can. I love doing it, and it's we could go for hours, but it's been a joy to bring some of these insights to people, and to try to live by these principles. And for me, it's important to live the things that I talk about as well. And, I'm still learning every day also.
Be the change you want to see in the world, right?
Somebody famous said that once. Yep.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. So
Yeah.
it was great having you, Michael. Again, I'm really, really impressed and happy to have you here. Great discussion, and keep up that amazing work. And I look forward to hearing more about how your son does through his
Yeah. He's
football
in the big,
career and life
yeah,
career. And
he's in the big recruiting moment right now. So we were at a camp yesterday. He's throwing for a college this morning, and he's
Wow.
got a bright future ahead of him. And I'm super proud of him and his sister there. You can see in a picture, and he's got an older sister. He's got a younger sister. I have an 11-month-old.
oh wow,
Wow.
There's,
Oh my God.
so it's fun.
yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, a lot of wisdom today, Michael. Thank you for sharing that with us. And just to mention to everyone listening or watching, the book is called Change. You can get it on your website. I'm assuming Amazon too, right?
Yeah, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Ingram, all those places. It's called Change, and you can go to my website, michaeljlopez.coach, and there's a link to order it right there as well. And you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. You mentioned the podcast I do on LinkedIn, and we got a newsletter and all those cool things that a lot of people have. But I try to bring a lot of these conversations into those that content, and give people a chance to talk about contemporary business issues and change and all of that wrapped up into one. So you can find all that on my website.
Fantastic.
Excellent.
Thanks for that.
Well, I
Yeah.
look forward to keeping on following you.
Same.
Yeah.
Thanks,
All right,
guys.
Michael. Thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Take care.
You too. All right, Dr. E. Some good stuff there.
Absolutely.
Really?
Absolutely. I love these discussions. You never know, you never know what you're going to, it's like, these podcasts are like a box of chocolates, right? You
Yes,
never know what
they
you're
are.
going to get. And they're all good.
Yeah. I really like the sort of the wisdom that he shared from the Navy SEALs.
Yeah. That was
Thought that
very
was
cool.
very interesting. Obviously, the SEALs known for having to be able to perform under extreme pressure. So
Well, and I'm so impressed with being in a room with all these people with this experience. They said,
yeah,
"What do
how
you
about
know?
that?
What do you see?" I mean, that's just so impressive and it's good to hear that we have people who are in positions of military leadership that realize the equity that they have, the value that they have in people who might not have the experience, but yes, they recognize the potential for great wisdom that's independent of age, just in their knowledge and
Yeah,
their skill sets and what they've seen.
yeah, and also just great that he raised his hand and took on the challenge. I feel like that's great advice he gave there. Raise your
Yeah,
hand for the hard job that no one else wants.
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it's been another good one, buddy.
Absolutely. Well, yeah,
So
great.
until next time.